Story 1. I'm a hospital receptionist at a hospital near South Park in Chicago. My shift begins at 3 a.m. I greet visitors, make appointments, and look as nice as a 30-year-old man who hasn't slept in hours can look. That night, as we call it, it was just me and a few nurses on the floor. Other than that, it was ghost quiet except for the heavy rain. I was sitting on an old recliner chair and listening to the television on the corner of the ceiling as a broadcaster relaying a seemingly important message. Yet again, there was another crazy person on the loose. A woman this time with no name and face supposed to look out for. Not creepy at all, I thought to myself. I focused back on my desk and continued working, but was still listening to the news anchor as she continued to warn people about that woman. Apparently, she was walking around and asking people very bizarre questions, and everyone was asked to immediately call 911 if encountered anyone suspicious. The news was quite odd, but I wasn't sure if anything could scare me anymore. Working here at the hospital, I thought I had seen it all. I had seen people come in with severed arms, legs, and fingers, people who met terrible accidents, and much more. I got used to it. My head was practically sunk into my desk as I filled out paperwork. That's when I heard something very subtle. I heard it coming from the front door, the automatic doors opening and closing, slamming each other a few times. The very dim lighting I had surrounding my desk began flickering incessantly. "Hello?" I called out from behind my desk, but only the whistling wind responded. I called out again, still no answer. I felt obligated to check if someone was there, thinking it might be someone injured and needed our attention. I reluctantly picked myself up from the chair and walked over to inspect, and almost slipped at the entrance as the floor was almost flooded from the rain. I noticed footsteps from wet shoes coming inside the hospital and then back out. I stood near the door, poking my head outside, trying to look for someone, but found nothing. It was only for a matter of time as I sat back on my chair when the doors started opening and shutting shut, letting more rain as they did. But this time I heard gentle footsteps make their way towards me, tapping closer and closer. Someone emerged from the darkness between the entrance and the front desk. A woman with drenched black hair approached, wearing a dark brown trench coat and a pair of ragged boots that were too large for her toothpick legs. Her black mascara was smudged, and despite the heavy rain, she didn't bother wearing a hoodie. "Hello, how can I help you, ma'am?" I asked, but she didn't respond. She looked around, scanning the area. She stopped and looked straight at me. We engaged in a brief stare, down which she won. As creeped out as I was, I looked down and pretended to gather important paperwork. "Are you here to visit someone?" I asked again to break the silence, and finally, she responded without saying anything. She just nodded and took a few steps forward. She was walking very weirdly in the most unnatural way possible. I usually don't get scared easily, but something about her felt really off. She crept me enough to give me goosebumps. I had my cell phone in the drawer and was ready to dial 911 if she did something alarming. I handed her a piece of paper and told her to fill it out and wait till the visit hours began. She picked up the pen but stopped and asked me, "Do you reject God?" I was taken aback by this question. "Excuse me?" I said, but she didn't say anything and just smiled. Her ease widened and the corners of her mouth almost touched her ears. At this point, I was convinced that she was just a crazy woman and told her to leave, or I would call the cops. She stopped smiling, turned back, and left. The room was silent again, and sighed in relief as I got back to work, but her creepy mannerisms were trapped in my mind. At around 4:30 a.m., one of the hospital children came up to me. "Lena, is that you?" I called out to her. All the kids at the hospital knew me, and I was proudly considered one of the cooler employees. I brought them snacks and told them scary stories. The nurses would get angry with me every time I had a scary story night, as they would have to deal with a bunch of wet bed sheets in the morning. It was very odd to see Lena awake at that time, so I asked her what was wrong, and she said she didn't like the new nurse. She kept asking the same question over and over again. Even when I answered no several times, Johnny was laughing with her and saying yes to her. "I don't want to go back," said Lena in a trembling voice. Lena's words immediately played flashbacks inside my mind. Something about a strange woman going around and asking people strange questions, and the woman who came in minutes ago. Even if I had thought she left, I ran upstairs straight into the children's ward. I stormed inside and saw Johnny was missing from his bed. I woke up my coworker and asked about Johnny. We searched everywhere and put the hospital on lockdown. We set off all the alarms and called 911. The police arrived and searched the whole premises, but they never found the woman nor Johnny. It has been 4 years since that incident and they still haven't found him. The woman also disappeared and was never seen again. Story 2. This story happened 3 years ago when I was working at a food franchise. I worked the graveyard shift along with 3 of my colleagues, Seth, Robbie, and Mia. We also had a shift manager who monitored our shift and assigned us breaks and other stuff. It was around 11 p.m., and we were about to close in an hour. There was nothing much to do than redo everything we had already cleaned. Our shift manager, being the laid-back woman she was, said that we could do whatever, but we would have to come back immediately if we began to pick up orders. She only said this so she could go out back to smoke a cigarette and scroll through her social media. Robbie and Mia decided to sneak out as they knew the manager wouldn't return back inside until it was closing time. So they took Robbie's car and drove off before our manager even noticed. This left only Seth and I alone in the store. After a while, I noticed something on one of the monitors. A man just stood there. He was extremely tall and lanky, and his arms were exceptionally long. It may sound like I could be exaggerating, but his arms literally reached his knees, and his skin did a horrible job uncovering the bones underneath. His eyes looked like they were going to pop out of his skull. He just stood there swaying from side to side. I was completely freaked out, but Seth just laughed, saying he must be stoned, and I laughed it off too, only to make me feel better. He stood there for another 5 minutes and then walked away. I felt relief as I saw him walk away, but this relief didn't stay for long. There was a beep coming from a stall, which meant someone pressed the red button and wanted to order. Before I was able to greet the person, I was already greeted with a jagged breathing. It sounded like someone was desperately trying to breathe. I was already turning cold at this point, but I gathered up my courage and spoke. "Welcome to Sonic. Order when you're ready." The person said nothing but breathed heavily. I felt all the hair on my body stand. I repeated it again in case I wasn't audible but heard just more breathing. After a while, I hung up because I was getting freaked out. It was now 11:30 p.m. and we were gathering our stuff together as it was almost closing time. We both heard the back door open and close. We figured it was just Robbie and Mia sneaking back in before our manager came back. "You guys are early," Seth called out, but there was no response. Seth called out again, but still no response. I could see Seth getting irritated. He went outside cussing them but got quiet. I went after him to figure out what was up. I stood next to Seth as I saw why he had gone quiet. It was that man from outside. He had come inside through the door our manager usually cracked open so she didn't get locked out while out in the back. He just stood there staring at us, his eyes wider than ever, and white stuff bubbled from his mouth. Then he pulled out something from his back pocket. It was a knife. Seth and I both were frozen in our places, not knowing what to do. We thought he was going to attack us, but pulled up his sleeve, revealing his bony arm, and started cutting his arm while making a gasping noise along with blood-curdling screams. I covered and ears and screamed in horror, and Seth stood there in shock. He stopped after a while, turned back, and left limping toward the door on one leg and dragging the other. Seth and I stood then without moving an inch until Robbie and Mia arrived, filling the silence with their laughter. They saw the terrified looks on our faces, and we immediately told them everything that happened. At first, they didn't believe us. I guess the tone and look on our faces showed we weren't lying. Our manager walked in a few minutes later and told us we were ready to leave. I asked if we could play the footage from an hour ago, and she agreed. As I watched the tape, I was even more stunned at what I saw. There was no man in the drive-thru or standing at the stall. Me and Seth were standing there terrified. I now work for a private company and am still in touch with Seth, Robbie, and Mia, but we never talk about that incident. Story 3. This is the story of when I was 21 years old. I was working at a gas station back then. I worked the night shift, and in the morning, I would attend my classes. This one unforgettable incident is the scariest thing I have ever experienced. It was a winter night. I was sitting at the cash counter. I had my earphones on, and I was watching a movie on my phone. There were barely any customers because of heavy snowfall, but I had earphones on one side of my ear in case a customer walked in around 10 p.m. I heard a car getting parked in the parking lot. I thought it was a customer, so I got off my phone and looked at the entrance door, expecting someone to walk inside the store. I stared at the door for a good few minutes, but no one did. I figured they just needed some gas, and so I put my earphones back on. It was now 10:30 p.m., but I didn't hear any car leave. I got curious, and as I was about to go outside to inspect, a man who looked to be in his late 20s walked in. He had curly, shabby hair and had very prominent eye bags, as if he hasn't had any sleep for the past few days. He only had one jacket on, which was weird, considering it was a cold night, and the jacket seemed too big for him. He came up to me and said that he was heading south to see his family for the holidays, but stopped because of the snow on the roads. He smiled as he said that, and I could see his yellow teeth piercing through as he spoke. I was concerned he would ask for a freebie, as this man almost looked homeless, but he went on and grabbed some snacks, put them on the counter, and gave the money. I thought nothing of it, and as he was walking out of the store, he stopped and turned and asked where the washroom was. I told him it was right at the back of the store. He then left. I had a weird feeling about that guy. I don't know if it was a gut feeling, but I decided to follow him. I stood near the door as I watched him go back to his car. After putting his stuff inside, he looked around and opened his trunk. I wasn't able to see properly because of the snow and the way he parked the car. He closed the trunk and walked towards the washroom, but it looked like he was dragging something. I dialed 911 just to be safe and told them there was a suspicious man lurking near the store. That's when I heard a muffled scream that sounded like a woman's voice. Now my heart was beating like crazy. Many questions were running through my mind. Who was this man? What was he doing? I knew I heard a woman scream. I decided to go check the back, but I was careful. I just had a pair of scissors to protect myself if needed. I slowly crept into the back alley, and just as I turned the corner, I saw him holding a metal rod with blood all over his jacket, and the white snow was now all red. I saw the body of a woman tied by the hand and mouth, covered with a piece of cloth, lying lifeless by the washroom door in a pool of blood. It was her scream that I heard earlier. As soon as he saw me, he smiled wide and said, "You're next," and sprinted in my direction. I was frozen, but when I saw him running towards me, my first instinct was to get out of there. I ran back inside the door, and for a matter of seconds, he wasn't able to catch up. I locked the door. He kept banging and hitting the door with the rod. I hid and crouched behind the counter, waiting for the cops to arrive. I could only hear the loud bangs and cursing. While I hid there, it felt like hours. The whole time my heart was racing, and I was thinking he would break in any moment now and kill me. I sat there praying and crying. The cops came, and surprisingly, the man didn't even faze or try to run when they arrived. He was still hitting the door with his fist to break inside. I came outside and saw them pinning him to the ground as he looked up at me and smiled. The manager of the store came, and in a few hours the police escorted me back home. The next day the news was on broadcast. The man was a psychopath who had escaped a mental asylum. He was walking near the highway. A couple in a car saw him and offered him help. He had killed the husband and dumped his body on the roadside, wore his jacket, and tied up the wife before putting her in the trunk. And the rest is what happened at the gas station. After this incident, I quit the job and started working at a supermarket which was inside the city. I am 24 now and still work at the supermarket, but will soon find a better paying job as I have graduated from college. I still have nightmares of that day and wonder if I hadn't listened to my gut, I would have been dead. Story 4. This story takes place when I got a divorce from my ex-wife. We ended things as fights would often occur, and even the neighbors were sick of us. After the divorce, she got most of everything along with our 5-year-old daughter. I was short on money at the time and was staying at my friend's place. He let me stay there for as long as I needed while I searched for jobs to get my life back on track. I came across the post of a security guard at a cemetery. It was a high-paying job, and I thought I had finally found my niche. During the interview, I found that this job was for the night shift. I wasn't too sure about this job, but I had bills to pay, and so I accepted the job. I started a few days later. It was a fairly large cemetery, and lots of rich people were buried in that ground, so it wasn't a surprise that this could be a nice place for grave robbers. This graveyard had a guardhouse, and security cameras were placed in every corner. I was working with 2 senior security guards, John and Samuel. Our task every night was to complete 2 rounds and monitor the area. My shift would start at 10 p.m. through 6 a.m. The job itself wasn't too bad. It was almost a week since I joined, and I had already gotten a little close to John and Samuel. I was making my round as usual that night, and after the first circuit, I went back to the guard office, sat on my chair, and looked at the security footage. John and Samuel were still making their rounds while I was drinking my coffee. Suddenly, I saw someone standing near one of the lampposts on the east side of the cemetery ground. The silhouette looked like that of a woman facing the opposite side, so only her hair was visible. She was wearing a long white dress and her hair reached to the shoulders. It was odd to see someone strolling the graveyard at such an hour. I stared at her for a few minutes, then she started walking, but the weird thing was she walked backward. It felt creepy looking at her, but didn't mind, as I knew Samuel would go into that part of the graveyard next and confront her. Maybe she was a homeless person looking for a place to spend the night, I thought to myself. I watched her as she walked and stopped at another lamppost, and her body started twitching. Seeing this, I was even more creeped out. Her head started bobbing back and forth as if she were possessed. She started walking again, but this time her walk was very unnatural, like a zombie. My heart began to pound. I am not someone who gets scared easily, but was scaring the shit out of me. In the next camera, I saw Samuel going in that direction. I got even more scared, and when Samuel reached where she was standing, she turned around. I couldn't see her face as it was mostly covered with her hair, but I could see 2 horn-like things projecting out from her head like a goat. That lady did not seem like a human, and I knew Samuel could get into a dangerous situation. I left everything and ran toward Samuel. I ran as fast as I could, gasping for air, and finally reached the part where I saw that lady, but there was no sign of her or Samuel. I was sure Samuel walked in this direction, and even if decided to return, we would have met at some point. I was losing my mind and didn't know what had just happened. I went back to the chamber and saw John and Samuel sitting inside. I asked Samuel, but he said he never went to the east side of the graveyard, and neither did they see any woman. They thought I was messing with them and said it was a good story, but my horrified face said otherwise. They told me to go rest and said I was probably hallucinating since I barely get enough sleep. I still wonder if it was real what I saw that day, or just my imagination. Did I imagine Samuel as well? What was it that I saw? Everything remained a mystery. Story 5. My name is Luke, and I work at a pizza joint in Chicago, and I unfortunately have the worst responsibility of delivering pizzas at night. And during weekends, I have asked my boss for day shifts, but she seems to ignore my requests and give shifts I don't want the most. I know being a pizza delivery man is somewhat of a dangerous job, but I never imagined anything like what happened to me a few months ago could actually happen. There is this one customer who always calls in and acts strange as hell on the phone. Sometimes he would just hang up on you, and sometimes he would order pizzas normally but with weird toppings like eyeballs, severed fingers, and body parts, and also make crazy sounds while ordering, and then hang up. We always thought this guy was just an idiot playing pranks on us. He would make really weird comments too, like, "I would like to order a pizza with mustard, olives, mushrooms in your skin." I will never forget that one. We usually just hang up on him now, and we always know it is him calling because his number is saved in our system. One night he called again and ordered a pizza normally, with no weird requests or comments, and gave his address too. I thought it would be interesting to finally deliver to this guy, and when I drove up to his house, it was something you would see in a scary movie, old and almost abandoned with no lights on. It was situated on the outskirts of the city, a part where we usually don't deliver. The house looked like it was 100 years old. I wasn't scared or anything, just looking forward to seeing what he looked like. When I went to the front door, I rang the bell, but it wasn't working, so I knocked. I realized I had forgotten the guy's soda and thought he'd give me shit for sure or just freak out on me. Nobody answered right away, so I knocked once more on this big door. He opened up after that second time. He was wearing this weird-looking mask around his mouth, and his eyes were opened wide, and I told him how much the pizza was, and that I was sorry I forgot his drink. He looked down, I think, and then said in a raspy voice that it was okay, and then looked at me again. I stood there looking at him for a few seconds in silence when I got bored of this and told him the amount again. He said okay, and then he asked me if anyone ever attacked me before, to which I replied no, and if they did, they would be sorry. He then took off his mask and revealed his face completely. He had big scars all around his mouth. I have no idea what they were from and can't even imagine what they might have been from. But he looked seriously messed up. He smiled at me, and his lips were all cracked. He then opened the door and slashed my arm with a sharp object. I fell backward and looked up at him as he let out a sinister laugh. I placed my other hand over the wound as I groaned in pain. He started walking toward me, but I got back up and rushed back inside my car. My arm was hurting and I could feel my heartbeat throughout my whole body. I gathered up my strength as I tried to drive away. He slammed the side of the car with his fist and screamed as I drove off. I went straight to the police station, and I was taken to the hospital immediately. I told them everything, and 2 officers were dispatched to find him. But when they reached that house, there was no one inside. They never found that man. The cut was very deep, and I had to get stitches. 2 months later, I joined back and got my shift changed to the day shift. And I don't go delivering pizzas now. The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.